All of the ethical theories we're going to explore are going to contend with questions related to harm, ethical questions related to harm. When we talk about harm, we're talking about damaging something or someone, hurting something or someone, injuring something or someone. You can harm the economy with particular economic policies. You can harm another person physically, psychologically, emotionally. Okay, so when we talk about harm, in the broadest sense, we're talking about a diminishment of well-being. So something exists, something or someone exists in a particular state of being at a given moment in time. That state of being has a particular quality to it, and if we harm that thing, we're degrading or diminishing the quality of that thing's state of being. Okay, questions related to harm are questions like these. What kinds of harms are tolerable? Okay, in our culture, we've decided that we're willing to tolerate the harm that's created when spouses lie to one another. We haven't passed laws that make it illegal for spouses to lie to one another. In fact, we've gotten rid of in many states no-fault divorce, where a divorcing couple could have an unequal distribution of the couple's assets based on whether or not one spouse or the other was lying to the other. And we've gotten rid of those laws, and the rationale is that, well, the laws that prevent the harm that's created by spouses lying is actually greater than the harm that's created by spouses lying. So we're willing to live with spouses lying with one another. Not to say we think it's good, we're just willing to tolerate it. Another question might be, how do we balance or distribute harms? You might think back to the COVID lockdowns, and we said, okay, so it's a dangerous world out there. We're going to make those frontline healthcare workers, they're going to have to bear a greater degree of risk and harm than the grocery store workers. And the grocery store workers are going to have to bear a greater degree of risk and harm than the school teachers, because we're going to allow them to work from home, that kind of stuff. Okay, so how can we justify how we distribute the harms that we know we have to contend with? And of course, that raises the question, well, how do you justify distributing a harm deliberately? Like, what serves as appropriate justification for distributing the harms in the way that we do? And you might think again back to during our experiences with COVID, when there were some employers, the U.S. military, that were creating pokey mandates. I can't say the V word because that might get this taken off of YouTube. Okay, so there were some employers in the military that were mandating that people get a jab in order to continue working. And if they didn't, or they refused, then they were fired. They were released from the military. There were some students that weren't allowed to go to school. So how do we justify how we distribute these harms? Now, think about these questions from an ethical egoist position, okay? If what matters the most to the ethical egoist is advancing one's own best interest, then you can see with these questions here why some people don't regard ethical egoism as a viable ethical theory, because the way that we would address these questions here, which has to do with what impacts we think are justifiable for us to have on others, for the ethical egoist, it's always ultimately going to come back to themselves, not the other person, right? Because for the ethical egoist, the thing that matters most is advancing one's own best interest. So what I should or shouldn't do to that person over there ultimately is determined by whether or not it's good for me to do that thing to that other person. And that's what causes people to say, like, no, ethics is supposed to guide you in how you're supposed to deal with that other person based on their value, not just yours. So let's look at how we might handle this question of harms and what kinds of harms are tolerable and how we should distribute harms by examining the case of Richard Parker. Was he unjustifiably harmed? So you know the situation. 4 sailors that are shipwrecked, not shipwrecked, they're on a life raft after their ship is sunk. And they're all sick, they're all weak, but Richard Parker is really sick because the dummy drank a bunch of seawater, which is put him on death's door, okay? And so these 3 other sailors are sitting there saying, like, hey, you know, Ricky over there, he ain't looking so hot. And I don't know how many more hours or days we have to live before we all just starve to death. So we have a choice to make. Either all 4 of us may die, or maybe we turn Ricky over there into some foie gras and the 3 of us can survive for a little bit longer. And fortunately for Richard Parker, he's an orphan. He's got no spouse that depends on him. He's got no children who depend on him. So thinking back to the trolley problem logic, these 3 other sailors are probably looking at this and saying, look, the 3 of us all have families. They have people who depend on us. And so if we all die, then the amount of harm that's going to be created is going to be much, much, much greater than if we just stick a knife in Richard's throat over there and then mac on him for a few days and hope that we're going to survive. Now, from a utilitarian standpoint, you can see how this logic would make some sense. When loss of life is inevitable, fewer lives being lost is preferable to greater lives being lost, right? Trolley problem logic. Okay? But that's only if we confine the utilitarian consideration to those who are on the boat. Okay? But of course, those who are on the boat come back to society. And when they come back to the society and people learn what these three sailors have done, they're mortified. And the three sailors are like, hey, what are you mortified about? It's like, what were we supposed to do? Okay? So then the question becomes this. So now that this is an issue that's beyond the boat, okay? This is an issue now about society itself. And the question for the society is, in the wake of this harm that's been inflicted on Richie Parker, what moral judgment of these three surviving sailors is going to serve the greatest good for the greatest number? In other words, as a society, how should we respond to this harm? Is it something we should tolerate? Or is it something that we shouldn't tolerate? Should we condemn them or forgive them? And you see here that we have this kind of rub up here of consent versus compassion. So what people are going to be mortified by, what we may be mortified by, is that Richard Parker had his life taken without his consent. He didn't give permission to be killed. These three sailors simply took his life. And that's probably what really rubs us the wrong way, right? Not necessarily that Richard Parker died, but that Richard Parker died without his consent. He was killed. He was murdered. Okay, so then on the flip side of that, though, is compassion. Right? Because remember what John Stuart Mill says is, anytime you're confronting these kinds of ethical questions about what the right way to respond to something is, you have this problem of competence. And what he means by that is, you can't judge reliably the ethics of a particular situation unless you have knowledge of the variables that are relevant to that situation. Okay? So you might think about, we send people off to war. They get in these incredibly intense circumstances that most of us cannot even fathom, even with all of the best Hollywood renditions of war movies, or of war in their movies. The experience of those situations, the psychological stress of those situations in wartime are so unimaginable, and people do things that are so unthinkable in those circumstances oftentimes, and then they have to come back to our polite society, where the rules for daily behavior are very different than they are in warfare. The expectations that we have of people and how they're going to regard each other are very different in our polite society than they are in war. And Mill might say, okay, so as a society, as you're grappling with how to regard what these three sailors have done, you're probably going to want to make sure that you have people who are responsible for evaluating the ethics of this issue who have some ability to understand what the stress is that these three sailors would have been in, and whether or not under those circumstances what they did is morally justifiable. The harm they created is morally justifiable. And one of the things they're going to be contending with is okay, so if this is a question for the greater good, for the greatest good for the greater number, what are people going to find more distressing? That we forgave the sailors for killing Richard Parker because of the circumstances that they were in that we couldn't understand, but people who can understand those circumstances have told us justify what they did? Or is the psychological stress of knowing that our society justifies cannibalism if the circumstances are intense enough, is that going to make us all freak out so much because we worry about ourselves getting in Richard Parker's position? Okay? So for the utilitarian to grapple with these questions of justifiable harm, the two things that are going to be really important are, okay, we want to make sure that there are competent people, in other words, people who have knowledge of the kinds of circumstances that they're going to be morally evaluating, doing this evaluation. And we want to make sure that we're considering everyone who's impacted by this event who wasn't on that boat.